The true story of the hidden architect of the Targaryen Dynasty, the shadow behind the throne. Picture this: 3 massive dragons soaring across the skies of Westeros, their roars echoing across 7 kingdoms as armies scatter like leaves in a hurricane. You've heard this story 1,000 times. Aegon the Conqueror, his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys, and their legendary dragons Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes. But what if everything you thought you knew about the Targaryen conquest was only half the story? What if the real architect of Aegon's victory wasn't the man sitting on the dragon's back, but the one standing beside the throne, whispering strategies that would reshape the entire continent? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most overlooked figures, a man whose brilliant mind and unwavering loyalty didn't just help win a conquest, but laid the foundation for 3 centuries of Targaryen rule. The year is 2 BC, and Westeros is a fractured continent, 7 separate kingdoms, each with their own kings, their own armies, and their own ancient grudges. From the north's frozen wastes to dawn's scorching deserts, these lands had never been united under a single crown. Most thought it was impossible. Most were wrong. When Aegon Targaryen set foot on the shores of what would become King's Landing, he brought with him more than just dragons and Valyrian steel. He brought a man who would prove to be worth 1,000 swords and 100 battle plans. This man didn't breathe fire or command mystical beasts, but his mind was sharper than any blade forged in the ancient fires of Valyria. His name was Orys Baratheon, and while history remembers him as Aegon's hand, few realize that without this man's genius, the Targaryen dynasty might have died before it ever truly began. This isn't just another retelling of dragonfire and burning castles. This is the story of the brain behind the brawn, the strategist who saw victory where others saw only chaos. The common tale tells us that Aegon conquered Westeros through fear and force. Dragons burned armies to ash, and kings bent the knee or faced destruction. But smart commanders don't just rely on overwhelming power. They use strategy, diplomacy, and psychological warfare. They understand that true conquest isn't just about winning battles. It's about winning hearts and minds, forging alliances, and creating a new order that can last for generations. This is where Orys Baratheon entered the picture, and where our real story begins. While poets sang of dragonfire and the thunder of Balerion's wings, few noticed the quiet man who stood at Aegon's right hand, planning each move like a master chess player, thinking 10 steps ahead. Orys wasn't just an advisor. He was Aegon's rumored bastard brother, sharing the same father but born on the wrong side of the blanket. In the ancient world of Westeros, bastards were often overlooked, dismissed as lesser beings unworthy of respect or responsibility. But Aegon saw something different in Orys. Maybe it was their shared blood, or maybe it was the sharp intelligence that blazed behind Orys's eyes like dragonfire itself. Whatever the reason, Aegon didn't just accept Orys as family, he made him the cornerstone of his entire conquest. The relationship between these 2 men was unlike anything Westeros had seen before. While most kings surrounded themselves with yes-men and flatterers, Aegon chose a brother who would challenge him, question him, and push him to be better. Orys wasn't afraid to speak truth to power, and Aegon was wise enough to listen. This partnership would prove to be the secret weapon that no enemy army could counter. When Aegon's small fleet approached the Westerosi coast, they faced seemingly impossible odds. The combined armies of the 7 kingdoms outnumbered them 50 to 1. Even with 3 dragons, the task ahead seemed insurmountable. But Orys had been studying the political landscape of Westeros for years, mapping out not just the geography, but the complex web of alliances, rivalries, and ancient grudges that defined the continent. He understood something that many conquerors throughout history had missed. You don't defeat 7 kingdoms by fighting 7 separate wars. You turn them against each other, exploit their weaknesses, and make them want to join you rather than fight you. This wasn't just military strategy, it was psychological warfare on a scale that Westeros had never experienced. The first test of Orys's strategic brilliance came even before the conquest officially began. As Aegon's ships approached the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, they encountered the first major obstacle, the Massey Kings and their river defenses. Most commanders would have simply unleashed the dragons and burned everything in their path. But Orys suggested a different approach. Instead of announcing their arrival with fire and blood, they would use stealth and surprise. The small Targaryen fleet would slip past the major strongholds under cover of darkness, establishing a beachhead before anyone realized what was happening. By the time the local lords could organize a response, Aegon would already be on Westerosi soil, digging in for the long campaign ahead. This decision proved crucial for several reasons. First, it demonstrated to potential allies that the Targaryens were not mindless destroyers, but calculating conquerors who could be reasoned with. Second, it prevented the immediate formation of a massive alliance against them. If the conquest had begun with widespread burning, every lord in Westeros would have united against the dragon threat. But perhaps most importantly, it established Orys's role as the strategic mind behind Aegon's military might. While the dragons provided the hammer, Orys provided the precision. He understood that true conquest required more than just force. It required timing, psychology, and the ability to see the bigger picture. As the Targaryen forces established their first foothold in Westeros, Orys was already planning 5 steps ahead. He had identified the key players in the coming conflict, mapped out their strengths and weaknesses, and developed strategies to deal with each potential threat. The Storm Kings of the Durandons, the Kings of the Reach, the proud lords of the Westerlands. Orys had a plan for each of them. The beauty of Orys's approach was its flexibility. Unlike rigid military commanders who stuck to predetermined battle plans, Orys adapted his strategies based on changing circumstances. When diplomacy could achieve what force could not, he chose words over swords. When enemies proved too stubborn to negotiate with, he unleashed the dragons with devastating precision. This adaptability would prove crucial in the months ahead, as the Targaryen forces faced challenges that no amount of dragon fire could solve. Political intrigue, supply line problems, the threat of assassination, the difficulty of governing conquered territories. These were problems that required a different kind of genius, and Orys Baratheon had that genius in abundance. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Orys was his loyalty. In a world where ambitious men constantly schemed for personal power, Orys remained absolutely devoted to Aegon's cause. He could have easily carved out his own kingdom, could have betrayed his brother for personal gain, could have used his position to enrich himself at the expense of others. Instead, he chose to be the power behind the throne, the invisible hand that guided the conquest to victory. This loyalty wasn't born from fear or obligation. It came from a shared vision of what Westeros could become. Both men understood that the fractured continent needed unity, that the constant wars between kingdoms were bleeding the realm dry. They saw themselves not as conquerors, but as unifiers, bringing peace through strength and creating a new order that could last for generations. The first major test of their partnership came at the Battle of the Trident, where they faced the combined forces of the Riverlands and the Stormlands. This wasn't just a military engagement. It was a test of everything Orys had planned and prepared for. The outcome would determine whether the conquest would succeed or fail, whether the Targaryen dynasty would rise or fall before it ever truly began. As we prepare to dive deeper into this pivotal moment, remember that what you're about to hear isn't just another battle story. It's the moment when Orys Baratheon's strategic genius was put to the ultimate test, when the fate of Westeros hung in the balance, and when the true architect of the Targaryen conquest revealed the depth of his brilliance. The dragons may have provided the fire, but it was Orys who provided the strategy that turned that fire into victory. The stage was set for the most important battle of the conquest, and Orys Baratheon was ready to prove that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names are whispered rather than shouted. The Mastermind's gambit. The morning mist clung to the Trident's waters like a shroud, and across its banks, two armies prepared for what would become one of the most decisive battles in Westerosi history. But this wasn't just any battle. This was the moment when Orys Baratheon's strategic genius would either secure the Targaryen conquest or doom it to failure. King Argilac, the arrogant of the Stormlands, had finally made his move. The old Storm King had spent months watching the Dragon Lords burn their way across the Riverlands, and now he was ready to make his stand. But Argilac wasn't facing this threat alone. He had forged an alliance with King Harren the Black of the Iron Islands, creating a combined force that outnumbered the Targaryen army 3-1. On paper, it looked like an impossible situation for Aegon's forces. The Storm King commanded the finest heavy cavalry in Westeros, while Harren brought Ironborn raiders known for their ferocity in battle. Together, they had assembled nearly 20,000 seasoned warriors, all eager to prove that dragons could bleed just like any other beast. But Orys Baratheon had been preparing for this moment for months. While other commanders might have seen only the overwhelming numbers arrayed against them, Orys saw opportunity hidden within the enemy's apparent strength. He understood something that his opponents had missed. Sometimes the greatest advantage comes not from what you have, but from what your enemy thinks you don't have. The night before the battle, Orys gathered Aegon's war council in a simple tent beside the Trident. The atmosphere was tense. Even the most confident knights were nervous about the odds they faced. But when Orys spread out his maps and began to speak, something magical happened. His calm confidence began to spread through the room like wildfire. Orys had spent weeks studying his enemies, not just their military capabilities, but their personalities, their fears, and their weaknesses. He knew that Argilac was proud to the point of arrogance, always eager to prove his valor in single combat. He knew that Harren was paranoid and suspicious, constantly worried about betrayal from his own men. Most importantly, he knew that these two kings didn't really trust each other. Their alliance was born from necessity, not genuine friendship. The plan Orys presented that night was audacious beyond belief. Instead of trying to match the enemy's numbers, he would use their own strength against them. The Targaryen army would appear to retreat, drawing the enemy into a carefully prepared trap. But this wasn't just a simple ambush. It was a psychological masterpiece designed to exploit every weakness in the enemy coalition. The battle began at dawn, and at first, everything seemed to go according to the enemy's expectations. The Targaryen forces advanced across the Trident's ford, engaged the enemy briefly, and then began what appeared to be a disorganized retreat. Argilac's knights charged forward with triumphant battle cries, convinced that victory was within their grasp. But Orys had anticipated this reaction perfectly. The retreat wasn't real. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to lure the enemy into breaking their formation. As the Storm King's cavalry pursued what they thought was a fleeing army, they were actually being drawn into a killing field that Orys had prepared days in advance. The first phase of the trap was psychological. Orys had positioned his archers in hidden positions along the riverbank, but he didn't have them fire immediately. Instead, he waited until the enemy cavalry was fully committed to their charge, until they were so focused on the apparent victory that they forgot to watch for threats from the flanks. When the arrows finally came, they weren't aimed at the knights themselves. They were aimed at the horses. Orys understood that heavy cavalry was only effective when it could maintain its momentum. By targeting the mounts instead of the riders, he created chaos in the enemy ranks without immediately killing the knights, who might still be useful as prisoners or potential allies. The second phase was military genius in action. As the Storm King's charge faltered under the arrow storm, Orys signaled for the dragons to make their appearance. But this wasn't the typical dragon attack that enemies had learned to expect. Instead of having all three dragons attack at once, Orys had them appear one at a time, each from a different direction. Balerion emerged from the morning mist like a nightmare made flesh, his massive wings blotting out the sun as he descended on the enemy's left flank. But instead of immediately breathing fire, the great dragon simply circled overhead, his presence alone enough to terrify horses and men alike. The psychological impact was devastating. Soldiers who had been ready to fight suddenly found themselves paralyzed by primal fear. Then came Vagar from the right, and finally Meraxes from directly overhead. The enemy army found themselves surrounded by dragons, but not yet burned. This wasn't accidental. Orys had specifically instructed the dragon riders to create maximum psychological impact before unleashing their fire. He wanted the enemy to feel the hopelessness of their situation, to understand that surrender was not just an option, but the only rational choice. The masterstroke came when Orys himself rode forward under a banner of parley. While the enemy army cowered under the shadow of three dragons, the bastard brother of Aegon Targaryen calmly approached the enemy commanders as if he were discussing the weather rather than their imminent destruction. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries, but the eyewitness accounts all agree on one thing. Orys didn't just offer terms of surrender. He offered something far more valuable. He offered the enemy leaders a chance to join the winning side with their honor and lands intact. To King Argilac, Orys offered marriage between the Storm King's daughter and himself, creating a political alliance that would preserve the Durrandon bloodline while incorporating the Stormlands into the new Targaryen realm. To Harren's commanders, he offered pardons and positions in the new order, playing on their well-known frustrations with their paranoid king. The genius of this approach was that it split the enemy coalition at its weakest point. Argilac was too proud to accept terms from a bastard, but his knights were intelligent enough to see the writing on the wall. Harren's Ironborn were already looking for an excuse to abandon a battle they couldn't win. By offering different terms to different groups, Orys ensured that the enemy alliance would collapse from within. What followed wasn't really a battle in the traditional sense. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. As the enemy commanders argued among themselves about whether to accept Orys's terms, their formations began to break down. Some units moved to surrender, others prepared to fight to the death, and still others simply began to flee. The dragons finally unleashed their fire, but it was surgical rather than indiscriminate. Orys had identified the key leaders who refused to surrender, and the dragon fire targeted them specifically. The message was clear: those who bent the knee would be spared, but those who continued to resist would face the full fury of the Dragon Lords. King Argilac, true to his arrogant nature, refused to yield. He died as he had lived, proud, defiant, and ultimately foolish. His death marked the end of the Storm King's 1,000-year reign, but it also marked the beginning of something new. With their king dead and their armies scattered, the surviving lords of the Stormlands had little choice but to accept Orys's terms. The aftermath of the battle showed the true extent of Orys's strategic vision. While most conquerors would have simply burned everything and started over, Orys immediately began the process of integration. He married Argilac's daughter as promised, taking not just her hand, but also the Durrandon arms and words. This wasn't just political theater. It was a deliberate signal that the Targaryen conquest wasn't about destroying the old order, but about creating something new from its ashes. The Ironborn who had surrendered were given the choice to return to the Iron Islands or join the Targaryen forces. Many chose to stay, impressed by Orys's fair treatment of defeated enemies. These men would become some of the most loyal supporters of the new regime, proving that mercy could be more powerful than fear. But perhaps the most impressive aspect of Orys's victory was how quickly he moved to consolidate his gains. While the enemy dead were still being counted, he was already sending ravens to the other kingdoms, spreading word of what had happened at the Trident. The message was carefully crafted to demonstrate both the futility of resistance and the benefits of submission. The Battle of the Trident wasn't just a military victory. It was a propaganda triumph that would echo throughout the rest of the conquest. Every lord in Westeros now knew that the Targaryens weren't just conquerors, but rulers who could be reasoned with, who would honor their agreements, and who offered a path to prosperity for those wise enough to take it. As news of the victory spread, something remarkable began to happen. Instead of forming new alliances against the Dragon Lords, many of the remaining kingdoms began to send envoys to negotiate terms. The psychological impact of Orys's strategy had achieved what years of dragonfire might not have accomplished. It had convinced potential enemies that joining the Targaryens was preferable to fighting them. The genius of Orys Baratheon had transformed what should have been a bloody conquest into something approaching a peaceful transition. But the real test of his abilities was yet to come. The hardest part of any conquest isn't winning the battles. It's building something lasting from the victory. And that challenge would require every ounce of Orys's political and diplomatic skills. The Trident had proven that Orys could win battles through strategy and psychology. But could he win the peace? The answer to that question would determine whether the Targaryen conquest would create a dynasty that lasted for centuries, or just another short-lived kingdom built on dragonfire and destined to burn out when the dragons died. The bastard brother of Aegon Targaryen had proven himself to be a master of war. Now he would have to prove that he could be an equally skilled architect of peace. The invisible crown victory in battle is one thing, but building a kingdom that can last for centuries, that's an entirely different challenge. And as Aegon Targaryen stood over the ashes of Harrenhal, watching the greatest castle in Westeros burn like a candle in the wind, he faced a problem that no amount of dragonfire could solve. How do you rule 7 kingdoms that have spent 1,000 years learning to hate each other? The answer came from the man who had already proven himself to be worth his weight in Valyrian steel. While poets would sing of Aegon the Conqueror and his mighty dragons, the real architect of the 7 kingdoms was working behind the scenes, weaving a web of alliances, laws, and institutions that would outlast every dragon that ever lived. Orys Baratheon understood something that most conquerors throughout history had missed. Winning a war is just the beginning. The real challenge is creating a system of government that can survive the death of its founders, that can adapt to changing circumstances, and that can command loyalty not through fear alone, but through genuine respect and mutual benefit. The first test of this philosophy came in the immediate aftermath of the conquest. The traditional approach would have been simple: execute all the former kings, confiscate their lands, and install Targaryen loyalists as the new lords. It was brutal, but it was effective in the short term. The problem was that it created a realm built on nothing but fear, and fear alone is never enough to sustain a dynasty. Orys had a different vision. Instead of destroying the old nobility, he would transform them into pillars of the new order. But this wasn't just about being merciful. It was about being smart. These lords had spent generations learning how to govern their lands, building relationships with their people, and understanding the complex web of local customs and traditions that kept their regions stable. The masterpiece of this approach was Orys's own marriage to Argella Durrandon, the daughter of the defeated Storm King. This wasn't just a political alliance. It was a symbolic statement that the Targaryen conquest wasn't about replacement, but about integration. By taking the Durrandon arms and words as his own, Orys was telling the lords of the Stormlands that their traditions and their history would be preserved under the new regime. But the real genius of this marriage became apparent in the years that followed. Argella didn't just become Orys's wife, she became his partner in governance, bringing her intimate knowledge of Storm's End politics and her connections to the local nobility. Through her, Orys was able to identify potential troublemakers before they became problems, to understand the grievances of the common people, and to build a network of informants that stretched throughout the Stormlands. This pattern was repeated throughout the Seven Kingdoms, but always with Orys's careful guidance. When lords submitted to Aegon, they weren't just allowed to keep their lands. They were actively incorporated into the new power structure. Former enemies became advisors. Their children were invited to court, and their concerns were given genuine consideration in the new king's councils. The establishment of King's Landing itself was another stroke of Orys's political genius. Instead of ruling from Dragonstone, which would have marked the Targaryens as foreign conquerors, or from one of the existing great castles, which would have favored one region over the others, Aegon built his capital on neutral ground. The location at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush was chosen not just for its strategic value, but for its symbolic importance. It was a new city for a new kingdom, belonging to no single region, but serving all of them. Orys's influence on the design of King's Landing was subtle but profound. The Red Keep wasn't just a fortress, it was a statement of power that incorporated architectural elements from all seven kingdoms. The throne room was designed to accommodate not just the Iron Throne, but also the representatives of every major house. The small council chamber was positioned to ensure that the king's advisors could meet in private while still being accessible to petitioners from throughout the realm. But perhaps the most important contribution Orys made to the new kingdom was the establishment of the small council itself. This wasn't just a group of advisors. It was a carefully balanced representation of the various interests and regions that made up the Seven Kingdoms. The Hand of the King, the Master of Coin, the Master of Ships, the Master of Whisperers. Each position was designed to ensure that the Crown had access to the expertise and regional knowledge needed to govern effectively. The genius of this system was that it created a pathway for ambitious lords to serve the Crown without threatening it. Instead of nursing grievances in their castles, plotting rebellion, and dreaming of independence, the great houses could compete for positions of real power and influence within the royal government. This channeled their ambitions in directions that strengthened the realm rather than weakening it. Orys's role as the first Hand of the King was crucial in establishing the precedents that would govern this office for centuries to come. He wasn't just Aegon's chief advisor. He was the living embodiment of the principle that the crown served the realm, not the other way around. When lords came to King's Landing with grievances, they found in Orys a man who understood their concerns and who had the authority to address them. The establishment of the king's justice system was another area where Orys's influence was profound. Instead of simply imposing Targaryen law on the conquered kingdoms, he worked to create a legal framework that incorporated the best elements of each region's traditions. The result was a system that felt familiar to people throughout the realm, while still maintaining the unity and authority of the crown. This approach to justice had practical benefits that extended far beyond the courtroom. When people felt that the law was fair and that their traditional rights were respected, they were less likely to support rebellions or resist royal authority. The legitimacy of the crown was strengthened not through fear, but through the consent of the governed. But Orys's most subtle achievement was the way he managed the relationship between the crown and the faith of the Seven. Religion had always been a source of division in Westeros, with each kingdom maintaining its own interpretation of the Seven's teachings. A heavy-handed approach to religious policy could have sparked holy wars that would have torn the realm apart. Instead, Orys worked to position the crown as the protector and patron of the faith, while carefully avoiding any actions that might be seen as religious persecution. The construction of the Great Sept of Baelor was planned during this period, designed to be a unifying symbol that would demonstrate the crown's piety while also serving as a magnificent backdrop for royal ceremonies. The economic policies implemented during this period also bore Orys's fingerprints. Instead of simply extracting wealth from the conquered kingdoms, the crown invested in infrastructure projects that would benefit the entire realm. Roads were built to connect the major cities, harbors were improved to facilitate trade, and a common currency was established to replace the chaotic mixture of regional coins that had previously hindered commerce. These investments weren't just about immediate economic benefits, they were about creating bonds of mutual interest that would strengthen the realm's unity. When merchants in the north could easily trade with their counterparts in the Reach, when lords in the Riverlands could quickly communicate with their peers in the Westerlands, the Seven Kingdoms began to function as a single economic unit rather than seven separate entities. The establishment of the royal progress tradition was another of Orys's innovations. Instead of remaining isolated in King's Landing, Aegon would regularly travel throughout the realm, holding court in different regions and meeting with local lords and common people alike. These progresses served multiple purposes. They demonstrated the crown's accessibility, they provided opportunities to address regional grievances, and they allowed the king to be seen as a real person rather than a distant figure on a throne. But perhaps the most important aspect of these progresses was the way they allowed Orys to build personal relationships with the nobility throughout the realm. As the hand of the king, he would often arrive days ahead of Aegon, meeting with local lords, assessing their concerns, and preparing the groundwork for the king's visit. These preliminary meetings were where the real work of governance was done, where potential problems were identified and addressed before they could become crises. The success of these policies became apparent in the years following the conquest. Instead of the constant rebellions and civil wars that had plagued previous attempts at unification, the Seven Kingdoms enjoyed a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. Trade flourished, the population grew, and the great houses began to see themselves as part of a larger whole, rather than as competitors for dominance. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't accomplished without challenges. There were lords who resented the new order, regions that chafed under royal authority, and constant threats from beyond the realm's borders. But the foundation that Orys had helped to build proved strong enough to weather these storms. The true test of Orys's political genius came when challenges to royal authority did arise. The Dornish resistance, the occasional plots of ambitious lords, the religious tensions that periodically surfaced, these were all problems that required careful handling rather than simple force. And in each case, the systems and precedents that Orys had established provided the tools needed to address the challenges without destabilizing the entire realm. As the years passed and the conquest faded into history, the Seven Kingdoms began to develop their own unique identity. They were no longer seven separate kingdoms held together by fear of dragons. They had become a single nation with shared laws, shared institutions, and shared interests. The Targaryen Dynasty had become truly Westerosi, and Westeros had become truly unified. This transformation was Orys Baratheon's greatest achievement, greater than any battle won or any enemy defeated. He had taken the raw material of conquest and forged it into something that would endure for centuries. The invisible crown of his influence would guide the realm long after his own death, embedded in the very structure of the government he had helped to create. But there was still one more test to come, one final challenge that would determine whether the legacy of Orys Baratheon would truly stand the test of time. The dragons that had made the conquest possible were mortal, and the day would come when the realm would have to stand without them. Would the institutions and traditions that Orys had built be strong enough to survive that ultimate test? The eternal legacy death comes for kings and dragons alike, but ideas can live forever. And as Orys Baratheon drew his final breath in the halls of Storm's End, surrounded by the banners that bore both the Durandan stag and the Targaryen dragon, He left behind something more valuable than any crown or castle, a blueprint for governance that would outlast every dragon that ever soared through Westerosi skies. The true measure of any leader isn't found in the victories they achieve during their lifetime, but in how well their work survives after they're gone. By this standard, Orys Baratheon wasn't just successful, he was legendary. The systems he built, the precedents he established, and the culture he helped create would guide the Seven Kingdoms through 3 centuries of Targaryen rule and beyond. Consider the Iron Throne itself, not just the physical seat made from the swords of defeated enemies, but what it represented. Most people see it as a symbol of conquest, a monument to dragonfire and royal power. But look closer, and you'll see Orys's influence in every aspect of its design and purpose. The throne wasn't just built to intimidate, it was built to remind every king who sat upon it that leadership came with a price, that ruling required sacrifice, and that the crown served the realm rather than the other way around. The uncomfortable nature of the Iron Throne wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice, influenced by Orys's understanding that power should never be too comfortable. Every cut from those jagged swords would remind the king that ruling required vigilance, that decisions had consequences, and that the price of failure was paid in blood. This wasn't just symbolism. It was practical political philosophy embedded in metal and myth. The small council system that Orys established proved its worth time and again throughout the centuries that followed. When kings were weak, the hand of the king could provide strength. When crises arose, the diverse expertise of the council members could find solutions. When the realm faced external threats, the institutional knowledge preserved within the council could guide the response. The genius of this system became most apparent during the periods of greatest crisis. The Dance of the Dragons, the Blackfire Rebellions, the War of the Five Kings. In each case, the institutional framework that Orys had helped create provided stability even when the royal family was tearing itself apart. The realm could survive bad kings, civil wars, and even the extinction of dragons, because the foundations of government were stronger than any individual ruler. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Orys's legacy was how it adapted and evolved over time. The systems he created weren't rigid. They were flexible enough to accommodate changing circumstances while maintaining their essential character. When new challenges arose, the institutional framework he had built provided the tools needed to address them. The establishment of the Night's Watch as a neutral institution serving the realm rather than any particular kingdom was another area where Orys's influence was profound. By positioning the Watch as defenders of all humanity rather than just another military force, he created a tradition of service that would endure for millennia. The wall became more than just a fortification. It became a symbol of unity, a place where the divisions between kingdoms mattered less than the shared humanity of those who served. The economic policies that Orys championed during the early years of Targaryen rule laid the foundation for centuries of prosperity. The common currency, the improved roads, the standardized weights and measures, these might seem like boring administrative details, but they were the building blocks of a unified realm. When merchants could trade easily across kingdom boundaries, when lords could communicate quickly with their peers, when laws meant the same thing in the north as they did in the Reach, the Seven Kingdoms truly became one nation. The marriage between Orys and Aegella Durrandon also established a precedent that would shape royal policy for generations. By demonstrating that former enemies could become valued allies, that conquest could lead to integration rather than domination, Orys showed future rulers how to build lasting peace. The Baratheon house that emerged from this union would become one of the most loyal supporters of the Targaryen dynasty, proving that forgiveness and inclusion were often more effective than fear and punishment. The religious policies that Orys helped develop also proved their wisdom over time. By positioning the crown as the protector of the faith rather than its master, By respecting local traditions while promoting unity, the Targaryen kings avoided the religious wars that had torn apart other realms. The Great Sept of Baelor became a symbol of this approach, magnificent enough to demonstrate royal piety, but inclusive enough to welcome worshippers from all 7 kingdoms. The royal progress tradition that Orys established became one of the most important tools of Targaryen governance. These journeys weren't just ceremonial, they were essential for maintaining the connection between the crown and the people. When kings became too isolated in King's Landing, when they lost touch with the concerns of their subjects, the realm suffered. The progresses that Orys pioneered provided a mechanism for preventing this isolation. The legal system that emerged during the early years of Targaryen rule also bore Orys's stamp. Instead of imposing a single set of laws on all 7 kingdoms, the crown created a framework that respected local customs while ensuring justice throughout the realm. The king's justice became a traveling court that could address grievances anywhere in the kingdom, ensuring that royal authority was accessible to all subjects, not just those wealthy enough to travel to King's Landing. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Orys's legacy was cultural. He helped create a new identity for the 7 kingdoms, one that transcended the old regional divisions while still honoring local traditions. The lords of Westeros began to see themselves as part of something larger than their individual kingdoms, as participants in a grand experiment in unified governance. This cultural transformation was visible in countless small ways. The marriages between noble houses from different regions, the shared festivals and tournaments, the common language of law and administration, all of these contributed to a sense of shared identity that made the 7 kingdoms truly unified. The realm became more than just a collection of conquered territories. It became a nation with its own unique character and traditions. The military innovations that Orys championed also proved their worth over time. The integration of different regional fighting styles, the creation of a unified command structure, the establishment of royal garrisons in key locations. These reforms created a military force that was more than the sum of its parts. When external threats arose, the 7 kingdoms could respond with coordinated strength rather than fragmented resistance. The educational policies that emerged during this period also reflected Orys's influence. The maesters of the Citadel were encouraged to serve throughout the realm, spreading knowledge and maintaining communication between the various regions. This created a network of educated advisors who could provide expertise to lords great and small, ensuring that good governance wasn't limited to the great houses. The infrastructure projects that Orys championed had effects that lasted for centuries. The roads that connected the major cities, the harbors that facilitated trade, the bridges that spanned rivers. These weren't just construction projects, they were investments in the realm's future. Each road built made the kingdom more unified. Each harbor improved, made the realm more prosperous. Each bridge constructed made the people more connected. The diplomatic traditions that Orys established also proved their value over time. The practice of taking hostages from noble houses, the careful management of marriage alliances, the delicate balance of rewards and punishments, these weren't just tools of control, they were mechanisms for building trust and ensuring stability. When lords knew that their loyalty would be rewarded and their betrayal punished, they were more likely to choose cooperation over conflict. As the centuries passed and the Targaryen dynasty faced its various challenges, the wisdom of Orys's approach became increasingly apparent. The realm survived the madness of kings, the extinction of dragons, and the chaos of civil war, because the foundations he had helped build were strong enough to endure. The institutions he created, the precedents he established, and the culture he helped shape proved more durable than any individual ruler. The final test of Orys's legacy came with Robert's rebellion and the fall of the Targaryen dynasty. When the dragons were finally extinct and the royal family was dead or in exile, would the Seven Kingdoms fragment back into their component parts? Would the unity that had been forged through conquest and maintained through 3 centuries of rule finally break apart? The answer was revealing. Despite the change in dynasty, despite the trauma of civil war, despite the absence of dragons to enforce unity, the Seven Kingdoms remained united. The new king, Robert Baratheon, was a descendant of Orys through his marriage to Argella Durrandon. The institutional framework that Orys had helped create continued to function under new management. The cultural identity that had emerged during the Targaryen period persisted beyond the dynasty's fall. This continuity was perhaps the greatest tribute to Orys's genius. He had created something that transcended any particular ruler or dynasty, something that served the realm itself rather than just those who happened to wear the crown. The Seven Kingdoms had become a nation in the truest sense, with shared institutions, shared laws, and shared identity that could survive even the most dramatic political upheavals. Today, as we look back on the history of Westeros, we tend to focus on the kings and queens, the battles and dragons, the dramatic moments that capture our imagination. But the real story of the Seven Kingdoms isn't found in the throne room or on the battlefield. It's found in the quiet work of governance, in the patient building of institutions, in the careful cultivation of unity and shared purpose. Orys Baratheon understood this truth better than almost anyone in history. He knew that lasting change came not from grand gestures, but from careful planning, not from fear, but from legitimacy, not from conquest, but from integration. He built a kingdom that could outlast dragons, a government that could survive bad kings, and a legacy that would endure for millennia. The next time you hear the story of Aegon's conquest, remember that behind every dragon's roar was a whisper of strategy. Behind every burning castle was a plan for rebuilding. Behind every bent knee was a vision of unity. The dragons may have provided the fire, but it was Orys Baratheon who provided the wisdom to forge that fire into something lasting. In the end, that's what separates the truly great leaders from the merely powerful ones. Power fades, dragons die, and even the mightiest armies are eventually defeated. But ideas can live forever. And the ideas that Orys Baratheon helped bring to life continue to shape our world today, reminding us that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names are whispered rather than shouted, whose victories are measured in generations rather than battles, and whose true strength lies not in what they destroyed, but in what they built. The conquest of Westeros was Aegon's victory, but the creation of the Seven Kingdoms was Orys Baratheon's masterpiece. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy any leader can leave behind. Not just a kingdom conquered, but a nation created. Not just enemies defeated, but a future secured for generations yet to come. Remember this story, share it, because every time we forget the quiet heroes who shape our world, we risk losing the lessons they have to teach us. In a world obsessed with power and spectacle, Orys Baratheon reminds us that true greatness often comes not from the sword, but from the mind that guides it.